History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spectacular people. Welcome to this 554th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost Tours for the Theater of the Mind. I'm your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we have a location that was suggested by our listener, Matt Brooks. And this is Alberta's Crowsnest Pass. Lots of great history here and some great ghost stories to go along with that. Before we get into that, we want to welcome into the spectacular crew, Eva.
Thank you so much for joining our Facebook group.
And now this moment in Oddity.
The moment in Oddity was suggested by Dewey Oxberger. There is a suburban community in the hills of Los Angeles County, California called Hacienda Heights. Within that populace, there is a place that draws the curious and seekers of the strange and creepy. It is called the Gates of Hell Hacienda Heights. Urban legends abound when it comes to this place. It is said that the property used to be the home of a sanatorium that was shut down in the 1940s due to malpractice. The property is sealed off with fencing topped with barbed wire, looking ominous to those wanting to explore the area beyond. The gate itself used to be the back entrance to a different building other than the purported hospital. This building actually had an underground tunnel that led to the main building. The structure is said to be covered in cult symbols, and there are red stains inside and around the property. Whether rituals were actually performed here is uncertain, but just the sound of this place makes one's imagination run a little wild. Although many may wish to explore this decrepit and creepy location, it is advised to do little more than a drive-by to see the gate. Security cameras abound, and of course there is the challenge of the sharp wire itself. Creepy old buildings draw many of us to them, and perhaps there's nothing to this location at all. But some urban legends certainly can be odd.
Grab your slippers, hot chocolate, flashlight, and maybe even that baseball bat.
And now, this month in history.
In the month of September, on the 2nd in 1666, three sixes, the Great Fire of London started and swept through the city for 5 days. The fire started at a bakery located on the fittingly named Pudding Lane. Although this pudding name was actually inspired by the offal that the butchers of the area sent down to the river to be loaded on waste barges. I don't think we want to be slurping down that pudding.
Ugh.
Church warden and baker Thomas Fariner owned the establishment, and he was awakened in the wee hours of the morning by smoke coming in under the door of his bedroom. His bakery downstairs was on fire. He and his daughter escaped from an upstairs window, but their maid refused to jump from the window, and she became the first victim of the fire. Indecisiveness on the part of the Lord Mayor allowed the fire to become a storm that nearly engulfed the entire city. The fire was stopped by strong easterly winds and the Tower of London using gunpowder to create fire breaks. Most reports claim that only 8 people were killed, but historians believe the toll was far higher, with bodies being completely consumed, and because the destruction left economic and social problems that caused starvation and exposure. 15% of the city's housing was destroyed. London was rebuilt on its same medieval street plan, which remains the same today.
Nestled within the Canadian Rockies in southwest Alberta is Crowsnest Pass. The name is a translation of the Native American word that meant the nest of the crow. Crowsnest Pass is an area of stunning scenery, but also a place of tragedy, rum running, coal mining, and was the home of the last woman to hang in Alberta. There are many interesting stories about this location, and several of them seem to have ghosts connected to them. Join us for the history and hauntings of Alberta's Crowsnest Pass.
Crowsnest Pass is not just a geographic feature, but also the name of a municipality. The municipality of Crowsnest was formed in 1979 by combining 5 cities. We have the village of Bellevue, the town of Blairmore, the town of Coleman, the village of Frank, and Improvement District Number 5, which included the hamlet of Hillcrest. Many residents of Crowsnest Pass worked in coal mining, which had been a main part of the economy and the driving force of the growth of the population since 1900. The Canadian American Coal and Coke Company established the first town. Many immigrants from around the world came here to mine. Coal mines on the Alberta side of the pass have all closed at this point, so residents travel to the British Columbia side for work today. Rum runners, forest fires, coal mining, and natural disasters are all part of the legacy here. One of the main points of interest is the Burmese tree. Think of this as a tree skeleton. The Burmese tree is thought to have lived for 700 years, and then it died, leaving its twisted branches bare. This death occurred in the 1970s, and 2 decades later, the tree was toppled in a windstorm. Generally, this would mean that the tree would be left to decay back into the land or be hauled off for firewood. But the residents didn't want to lose their beloved tree, so they secured it with brackets and steel rods. In 2004, some vandals cut off one of its main branches, and the residents came back to its rescue and glued the large branch back on and braced it with a prop pole.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
Talk about love for a tree. They're like, we don't care what we have to do to keep this thing standing. It is not going away.
I have had some trees like that in my life. My childhood home had a Ficus benjamina with the most amazing set of branches, and I just literally, you would call me a tree hugger. I loved that tree.
Well, and if you think like baobab trees don't have any leaves on them and they're very cool looking, so a tree doesn't necessarily have to have vegetation on it to be cool.
The Frank Slide Interpretive Center tells the story of a natural disaster that took just 90 seconds to change the lives of the people that lived in the village of Frank. The Blackfoot and Kootenai had lived here before European settlers, and they referred to the nearby Turtle Mountain as the mountain that moves. They would never camp at the base of the mountain. The village was named for Henry Frank, who was a co-owner of the Canadian American Coal and Coke Company. Frank helped lay out the town, and by 1903 there were 600 people in the village. None of them knew how dangerous their location was. Turtle Mountain was an anticline, a geographic feature that forms when convergent tectonic plates fold rock layers into an arch. This makes for a very unstable mountain, as did the fault line beneath it. Add that to the mining operations with the digging of shafts and pulling material like coal out of the mountain, and Turtle Mountain was a ticking time bomb.
There were signs that were ignored. Coal would fall from the ceiling and seams of the tunnel, and rather than realize that this meant the mountain was unstable, the miners were glad that their work was made easier.
Oh dear.
All they had to do was shovel the coal into carts and bins. The mountain would shake on occasion, too. A warm winter in 1903 allowed more water into the caverns, and then that water froze in the fissures and caused erosion. The night of April 28, 1903, saw temperatures drop to below zero. The following morning, 82 million tons of limestone rock broke off the peak of Turtle Mountain and took just 90 seconds for the slide to reach up the opposing hills. So what I'm saying here is the tippy top of this mountain comes completely off, and it's like it went on a slide, kind of like when you're watching a ski jumper. You know how they get to the end and it kind of goes up? That's what this did. It went like down the hill, and then it was already going back up another hill.
Yikes.
So you can imagine the force. This section of slide was 3,300 feet wide and over 1,300 feet high, and it traveled at 70 miles per hour.
That is terrifying.
There was nothing anyone could do to escape, and at least 70 lives were lost, possibly 90. However, several survivors were pulled from the rubble, and Charlie the horse was found alive after being trapped in the mine for 31 days.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine?
Holy
They finally
cow.
break through into the mine, and they find this horse alive. He basically had chewed like the wood that was on the carts, and some of the water that caused the issue here, when it would melt, he was drinking that for water. But get a load of this. His rescuers did him wrong by allowing him to gorge on oats and brandy after that.
Oh, my word.
This was a starved horse, and eating that much killed him.
He probably colicked, which is a horrendous twist of the colon, intestines of the horse.
So it was a horrible way for him to die, too.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, since they gave him brandy, I don't know why you would give a horse brandy. It took any pain of that away. But I was like, holy cow, guys, he hasn't really eaten anything in 31 days. Maybe we take a little bit easy with him. Can't believe he survives that whole time, and then, boom, they save him, and it's
so
like,
sad.
now he's gone. Solid train cars were thrown 2 miles by the force. The village of Frank was buried under 150 feet of rubble. The sound was heard over 124 miles away. This was the most deadly landslide in Canadian history. The path of the slide still has no vegetation or soil to this day.
Such a devastating disaster leaves an opening for legends and ghost stories, especially when most of the dead were left buried under the slide. Many people who have visited the Frank Slide area claim to feel an oppressive feeling and a sense of being watched by something unseen. Disembodied whispers are heard, and strange lights are seen floating around the debris field. Could these represent miners' headlamps? Those lights bob around as though the spirits holding the lights are stumbling around on the rubble. Mysterious mists sometimes form, and visitors claim to see shadow figures and apparitions. Monty Lewis was a painted lady that worked in the village of Frank, and she was murdered one night. She was found hacked up good, and she had defensive wounds, so she fought for her life. A newcomer in town was blamed for the murder, and he was quickly hanged, but it is thought that they had the wrong man. Monty's lover is said to have confessed later, and he said he killed her because he had to repay a gambling debt. Monty liked to spend her money on expensive jewelry, and she wore it to bed every night for safekeeping. Apparently, her lover decided to kill her to steal that jewelry, but he actually didn't take the jewelry and only took around $200 Monty had in her room. Monty now haunts the streets of Frank, and her favorite thing to do is lure hikers off trails, and her screams are heard in the valley. Of course, these could be slide victims as well. In the 1980s, 2 boys were hiking through the pass, and they became lost and then trapped. The boys yelled for help, but their voices seemed to be drowned out by the stone walls of the mountains around them and something else. They claimed to hear the yelling of a woman. The lost hikers were found after their parents reported them missing, and a search party found them.
So we've had the deadliest landslide in Canadian history here, which is bad enough. But this location also boasts the deadliest mine tragedy in Canadian history. The Hillcrest Mine Disaster Memorial Park pays tribute to the victims of this mine explosion. Hillcrest started as a company town for Hillcrest Coal and Coke, eventually becoming Hillcrest Collieries in 1909. The name came from Charles Plummer Hill, who staked the original coal claim in 1898. Over time, 6 million tons of coal were pulled from this mine, and it was the kind of coal suitable for industrial use. The disaster occurred on the morning of June 19, 1914, right at shift change. There's always a problem with a buildup of gas in mines, and on this morning, methane gas had built to a dangerous level and it triggered an explosion. Men near the blast were killed immediately, but it would be the afterdamp that proved most dangerous. Afterdamp is a toxic mixture of gases released after an explosion. And part of the reason why we had this buildup of gas in this mine is like they took a week off and gave them a break, and so it just built up over that whole time while they weren't in it.
On top of that, fires started that also created suffocating smoke. Rescuers got to work immediately, bringing bodies to the surface in coal cars. Most on board were either charred or suffocated. Desperate family members gathered outside the mine. 189 men perished that day, of the 237 that had entered the mine. The first victim found was a man named Charles Ironmonger, who worked the hoist cable outside the mine that hauled miners to the surface in cars. The blast was so powerful that, despite being outside, Charles was thrown 60 feet into the air and into the hoist house. The oldest victim was 54, and the youngest was only 17. widows were left devastated and destitute. This would spark changes in workmen's compensation and safety regulations. The mine was reopened and would experience another explosion in 1926 that only killed 2 men. The mine permanently closed in 1939.
Hillcrest Cemetery is located at 204 Avenue on the eastern slope of Turtle Mountain in Crowsnest Pass and is a provincial historic resource that is on nearly 2 acres of land. 2 mass graves were dug at the cemetery to ensure the bodies were buried quickly. One grave was for the Protestants and the other for the Catholics. A beautiful memorial reads, "As they had worked, so they were laid, shoulder to shoulder in common graves." Every year since the disaster, residents of Crowsnest Pass have honored the dead at the cemetery. The first year was led by the International Order of Odd Fellows, and 1,000 people attended. Over the years, the community added a picket fence and curbing around the mass graves and several monuments. For the 100th anniversary, a major landscaping project was completed. The cemetery is said to be haunted by the victims of the disaster. People see shadow figures and strange lights here, too. And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
West Canadian Collieries opened the Bellevue mine in 1905 after coal deposits were found in 1903. The company founded the town of Bellevue on the flat land above the mine. The young daughter of one of the owners of the coal mining company had exclaimed, "Quelle belle vue," when she saw the view, which means, "what a beautiful view," and the name Bellevue stuck. The WCC opened many mines in the area. They had operations in Lille, which is today a ghost town, and they built the settlement of Maple Leaf next to Bellevue and opened the Mohawk Bituminous Mine there in 1909. Working conditions within the Bellevue mine weren't great, and employees would complain often and hold strikes. Fan systems that would help in mines later with pushing out gases weren't in use here. Fire bosses also were negligent in checking the gas levels. That is why during a partial shift change on December 9, 1910, the mine erupted in an explosion. The closest rescue crew was in Hosmer, British Columbia, which was 6 hours away by rail. Bellevue mine managers John Powell, Frank Lewis, and pit boss John Anderson knew they were the only hope, and they ran into the mine without protective gear or breathing apparatuses. The crew from British Columbia brought miners, engineers, fire bosses, pit bosses, and a town doctor. One rescuer named Fred Alderson died when he handed his breathing apparatus to another person. 30 miners had died, but it could have been worse if this had been a day shift. 200 men could have died.
Bellevue suffered more tragedy in a fire in 1917. Most of the business district was destroyed. That same year, Bellevue finally incorporated into a village. Surprisingly, they also elected the first female mayor in Alberta at that time. Miners held a 6-month strike in 1924. The mine had difficulties throughout the 1940s and 1950s, and then the mine lost its largest customer. Bellevue sought to sell on markets overseas but had no luck. The mine closed for good in January 1961. Today, the mine functions as a museum, and the Bellevue Underground Mine Tour maintains and operates 985 feet of restored tunnel that people can tour. On the seedy side of things, Bellevue was another big rum-running town. Emilio Picariello was the kingpin of the Crow's Nest rum runners. People called him Emperor Pick. He didn't live in Bellevue, but 3 local miners set their sights on robbing him when he came through on the Canadian Pacific Railway's train number 63. These miners were George Arkoff, Osby Alloff, and Tom Bassoff. I guess Off is a common part of a
portion of
surname.
Yeah.
They robbed the train at gunpoint, but Emperor Pick wasn't aboard. The men ran off and split up. Alloff headed for the United States, but Bassoff and Arkoff remained in the pass area. They were so brazen, they stopped at the Bellevue Cafe for food one day. They were reported, and 3 constables entered the cafe through the front and back doors, and a shootout ensued. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable Ernest Usher and APP Constable F.W.E. Bailey were killed. Arkoff was killed, and Bassoff was wounded, and he escaped into the rubble of the Frank Slide. He was pursued and eventually apprehended, but Special Constable Nicholas Kislick was shot and killed by friendly fire. Bassoff was found guilty of murder and hanged in Lethbridge, Alberta on December 22, 1920. Alloff was captured in 1924 near Butte, Montana, and returned to Alberta where he stood trial and was sentenced to 7 years for the robbery. He died in 1926.
The mine has many ghost stories connected to it. Bellevue miners reportedly saw a ghostly white horse walking through the mine shafts, sometimes accompanied by other ghosts. One of those spirits was a little boy, and the other was our traditional woman in white. Many of the spirits are seen mainly by school children visiting the mines and historic area. They will ask, "Who is that man?" And the teachers or tour guides will look where the child is pointing and see nothing. The Bellevue Mine runs a haunted mine attraction every Halloween.
Can you imagine being down in a mine and having it be a haunted attraction? That'd be so cool.
It would be, although I'd be worried about a collapse.
Yeah, no kidding.
2 staff members were in their stations awaiting their opportunity to scare guests when they felt a presence float above the top of them and then press down on them. This is weird enough, but it gets weirder because those scare stations weren't near each other. The cast had all gathered together at the end of the night, and the 2 staff members shared their experiences and realized they had both had the same thing happen to them.
A tour guide was leading a group one day, and she asked all the tour attendees to turn off their lights in the mine to show them how dark it could be. Suddenly, she felt as though she were kicked by a horse, so she turned on her light thinking she would find that a bratty kid had kicked her. After turning the light on, she saw that her tour group was too far away, so it couldn't have been one of them. On another tour, a different guide got to the same area where they do the turn off your lights thing, and she felt a pair of hands grab her and lift her up and then drop her a few inches away.
Oh my gosh.
She quickly turned on her light and saw that her tour group was, again, this one too far away for any of them to have grabbed her. Other tour guides have felt taps on their shoulders when no one is behind them. A father and his young son were on a tour, and they claimed to be tickled by something they couldn't see. They claimed that a voice whispered, "Fred." There was a rescuer that we had mentioned earlier who died when he was overcome by gas. And they've had some ghost hunters come through the mine, and they've said that they also had experiences with something that identified itself as Fred.
In 2016, Executive Director of the mine, Elaine Ruby, and Vice Chairman Ron Ruby shared an experience they had in 2013. The museum at the mine had just acquired a mine whistle. Later on a tour, Elaine and another woman heard a whistle, and Elaine told the woman that Ron had probably set up the whistle and was testing it. She later told Ron that the whistle sounded great, and he looked at her funny. He told her that the whistle was still on his desk.
Blairmore is the oldest permanent settlement in Crowsnest Pass. It first was used as a Canadian Pacific Railway stop that was called the Springs for a nearby cold sulfur spring. Who's getting in that thing?
Ugh. I know. There's people that get into sulfur springs, hot springs all the time, but
it was a cold one. I wouldn't be getting in that. At
that's
least
true.
I
was ignoring that detail. I was just thinking of the stench.
Yeah, I was like, at least if it's hot, it's got some kind of soothing effect, but cold? The name was changed to Blairmore in 1898, and the town was incorporated in 1911. Coal mining started here in 1907, and its economic prowess grew after the Frank Slide. An 8-month miners' strike took place in 1933. Emperor Pick, that we mentioned earlier, owned the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore, and he ran it as his front. In 1922, he and an accomplice named Florence Losandro shot and killed Constable Stephen Lawson. The men were caught, convicted, and hanged for the murder.
Lost Lemon Campground is in Blairmore at 11001 19th Avenue. The camp is named for the Lost Lemon Mine, and there's a legend about this mine that dates back to 1870. A party of prospectors left Montana heading for Canada, and 2 of the men, Frank Lemon and Blackjack, broke off from the group. They found gold ore along their way and decided to take samples back to Montana to find someone to bankroll a mining operation. The 2 men set up camp, but after a bit of drinking, the 2 fought with each other, and by morning, Blackjack had been killed by Frank Lemon. Lemon returned to Montana and confessed his crime to a priest, but not from guilt, but because he felt Blackjack was haunting him. He had heard ghostly moans the night after he killed Blackjack, and even saw disembodied glowing eyes. The priest sent a man to find the body of Blackjack and bury him properly, which was done, but it mattered not. Blackjack tormented Lemon until the man had gone insane. He was sent off to his brother's ranch where he died. The legend continued, though, with people seeking the Lost Lemon Mine and the treasure of gold there. Any search has been cursed with forest fires, bouts of illness, and even insanity, and people claim to see Blackjack's ghost guarding the area.
Green Hill Mine was started by the West Canadian Collieries in 1913 in Blairmore. The mine was on the side of Bluff Mountain and hit peak production in 1946 and was closed in 1957. Wolf Paranormal Investigations investigated the Green Hill Mine in 2013. They reported, Inside one of the machine buildings, hanging from a rafter, was a large object comprised of what looked like small branches tangled together into the shape of a kind of mobile. Reminds me of the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
Bolted onto the concrete floor were various pieces of smaller equipment, one of which may have been a crusher. Robin asked for a sign of any spirit presence, and almost immediately she reported hearing what she described as a growl. She asked Trevor if his stomach had just rumbled, and Trevor said he wasn't sure, but he didn't think it was him. This is why whenever mine growls when we're doing a ghost hunt, I say so.
Yes.
When Robin made a second request for a sign of spirit presence, both she and Trevor heard what they described as machinery grinding. Since there's no power to any of the buildings in the complex, Robin and Trevor went outside the building to see if they could find a possible source for the distinctive noise. They were unsuccessful. When they returned to the inside of the building and Robin asked a third time for a sign of spirit presence, both she and Trevor heard a pebble being tossed. Trevor noted that it came from behind Robin's back. Robin asked for the event to be repeated just to be sure it was not a fluke, and no sooner has she made the request than both she and Trevor heard the sound of many pebbles being dropped on the roof of the building.
The spirits are finally going, enough is enough. You've asked me how many times?
Yeah, they're like, what do I
doing
gotta
something
do?
immediately for crying out loud.
Do I gotta set my hair on fire and start dancing? The wind had come up, so they immediately went outside to see if trees were responsible for the sound. There were no cone-bearing trees near the building. There were only slender aspens whose limbs reached well above the roof. Robin and Trevor checked everything near the outside of the building, but they could not find the source of the sounds they heard. At the same time, Robin and Trevor were experiencing unusual events. Holly and Michelle were experiencing similar events at the compressor building, where a large boiler outside used to power the compressors that powered the air hoses and other tools. A request was made for a sign of spirit presence, and suddenly, from somewhere near the boiler, both Holly and Michelle heard the sound of pebbles being scattered across the concrete slab into which the boiler is bolted. Apparently the spirits here like pebbles. Trying to ensure that this was not just a fluke or a small animal, a request for confirmation of spirit presence was made. Both Holly and Michelle reported hearing pebbles being thrown on the roof almost immediately, as well as loud banging against the sides of the compressor building itself. Holly and Michelle investigated the exterior of the building, searching for possible causes for the odd sounds. They noted that the wind had come up and that there were several slender aspens swaying back and forth, but none were hitting the building, and there were no cone-bearing trees near the roof that could explain the sound of many pebbles being thrown down on it. Concerned that perhaps a nesting animal had been disturbed or that there was larger wildlife in the woods that could pose a potential threat, Holly and Michelle decided to leave the area. No, they were just scared by the rocks. And meet with Robin and Trevor to find a different area of the site to investigate. After reporting the events to Robin and Trevor, Holly and Michelle returned to the vehicle and sat inside to wait for Robin and Trevor to finish their investigation of the machine building. Again, they were clearly afraid of something. Interestingly, Robin and Trevor later reported hearing footsteps and a disembodied voice, both of which they attributed to Holly. However, they realized that Holly could not be the source of either sound. She and Michelle were in the car, which was parked approximately 100 feet away from the building that they were investigating.
Sounds like there's a lot of spirits hanging around there.
I mean, they're mines. We think that tunnels or caves can be very haunted because it's like you're going into the earth kind of thing.
Well, and it's all limestone too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're talking lots and lots of energy, and who knows what you're drilling into the earth, you're going to have something happen.
Crowsnest Pass is beautiful and provided an opportunity for new life to many immigrants. Coal mining brought work and wealth, but also tragedy for countless families. The mountains could be unforgiving, and now they seem to be unable to give up their ghosts. Is Alberta's Crowsnest Pass haunted?
That is for you to decide. Sounds like a beautiful area, especially to go hiking, and I love going down into mines and stuff, as long as I don't think about what I'm doing.
Right.
We'd love to have you guys check out our website at historygoesbump.com, and if you'd like to send us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com or any of our various social media. We did get a comment on YouTube from Granny Vapes 4154. I don't see many apparitions. I usually hear them or sense them. I can, if I concentrate, see them in my mind's eye, but if they aren't communicating, I don't usually bother. Now, with these things in mind, I've seen 2 full-bodied apparitions in my lifetime. One was my uncle who scared the stuffings out of me.
Oh.
I just didn't expect it at all. No forewarning. And it was my uncle, so it still bothers me that I reacted like I did. If I hadn't have just gone to the bathroom, I would have peed myself.
Oh my.
The other ghost was my son after he passed. That one I feel blessed to have seen and heard him. I've probably already told you that story. It's my favorite of all-time ghost stories. And I'd said, well, I can imagine it would be your favorite because it was, afterlife communication from her son. That's very cool. Then our most recent episode, we did the Hanford Bastille. And our listener, Connie, shared this experience. 12 years ago this month, I was visiting some friends in Hanford, California, and we got to talking about ghosts. They told me about an old jail that had been turned into a restaurant and reportedly it was haunted. I immediately stated that I wanted to check this place out, so we agreed to visit the following day. The next day we went into town and made our way to the restaurant. I was disappointed to see that they were closed, but one of my friends noticed that there were people inside, so she knocked on the glass. One of the employees came over and opened the door to see what we needed, and that's when my friend asked if we could take a look around. They promptly pointed at me and informed the employee that I loved ghosts. The employee let us in, gave a brief history of the place, and then told us that everyone who works in the restaurant becomes a believer within their first 2 weeks of employment. We were all wide-eyed at that statement, and then she offered to give us a brief tour. Woohoo! Off we went, upstairs, through rooms, downstairs. She even pointed out a spot on the stairs where a female inmate had committed suicide by hanging herself. As we know, she actually died from a heart attack, but it was all very interesting. She said she had to get back to work, but she said we could check out the solitary confinement area before we left. She pointed us down a hallway and told us that once we were done, we could exit out of the back door. We went down the hall and found 3 or 4 tiny cells that now could be reserved for a cozy dinner. Each contained one very small table and 2 chairs. How romantic. We could have had dinner in solitary confinement, Kelly. For some crazy reason, the 6 of us decided to cram into one of those solitary confinement cells, and we were laughing and making jokes. After a few minutes, we decided to leave, so one by one, we exited the cell. I was the last person in the cell. Before leaving the cell, I was compelled to pause and just stood there. I thought to myself, what an awful place to be stuck in, and turned to leave when suddenly someone grabbed the strap of my shoulder bag and gave it a strong tug. I turned back to see what my purse had gotten caught on, and there was nothing for it to catch on. I was at least 2 feet from the chair and 2 feet from the wall, and there was nothing for my purse strap to catch on. I let out a big scream, and my friends, who by this time were outside of the restaurant, came running in the back entrance. Everyone was talking at once, asking me what had happened, and my mouth was so dry I could barely get the words out. Something grabbed my purse strap. Something grabbed my purse strap. I remember that I was cold and needed to get outside in the sunshine. Once outside, I kept mumbling that I couldn't believe what had just happened. I said, "We have to eat here." Guess she wasn't that scared.
Girl after our own heart.
We had to wait for the restaurant to open, so we walked up the block and did some window shopping to kill time until we could return to the Bastille for lunch. We were seated in a large center room that was originally the mess hall for the prisoners. We sat at a large wooden table, and the waitress took our drink orders. Several of us ordered iced tea. Our drinks were placed on the table. I was sitting with my arms folded across my chest. Before I had a chance to unfold my arms, the lemon garnish from my iced tea floated up in the air, hovered, and then slammed down on the table. Everybody saw it. We all sat there, stunned. I said, "Did you all see that?"
Oh, my word.
Everyone very excitedly confirmed that yes, indeed, they did see it. Did I touch it? Everyone very excitedly confirmed that no, I did not touch the lemon. Our waitress heard the commotion and came over to investigate. I continued to sit there with my arms crossed. I did not want to touch my iced tea. Everyone else told the waitress about my 2 encounters. She looked at me and said, "They like you."
I love that.
Thanks for sharing that, Connie. I want to thank you guys for tuning into this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Dispatches from the Grave Digger.
We want to welcome into the cemetery James Wilfong. You're going to be buried in a chest tomb.
Thank you so much for supporting the show. We really could not produce History Goes Bump without our executive producers.
Be sociable. Drop the chain rattling, neck biting, and shape shifting, and join us on Facebook and Twitter at History Goes Bump. Like the page and follow us.
Crowsnest Pass is not just a geographic feature, but also the name of a... Especially doing it with a frozen mouth.
Shouldn't drink your very cold shake before trying to record.
I shouldn't, because it freezes my tongue.
My tongue isn't that what to work.
I'm just going to talk that way the whole time. Hope the listeners don't mind. All they had to do was shovel the tunnel in. Shovel the tunnel? Tunnel. They were shoveling the tunnel in.
Shovel the tunnel. Shovel the tunnel, Brick Road. Weather ritual. Weather ritual. Rituals. Weather. The R of weather and then the R of the rituals.
After damp is a toxic mixture of...
Mixture.
Mixture.
It's a mystery.
Just a mixture. It misted through the air.